The second colophon on the painting is by the preeminent connoisseur of the early 14th century, Zhao Mengfu. It takes the form of a poem, which reads, "Lofty mountains and flowing rivers fill the universe." It's natural to want to use water and ink to depict a landscape, but it's difficult. My entire life, I have strived to live up to the ideals of forest and streams. But because of my petty official duties, I've never been able to achieve this goal. What Zhao is really telling us is he admires the ability to translate the natural world into painting, and he makes a subtle reference to guoxi by referring to the lofty ideals of forests and streams. It's the title of a treatise on landscape painting by guoxi himself, in which he talks about how he would quiet his mind for several days, focus his thoughts, and then in a sudden burst of inspiration, pull forth the streams and mountains in his imagination and put them down on silk or paper. As we continue to unroll the scroll, we often see gaps in the historical record, and here, quite literally, is a gap. We see that a complete length of paper, a single sheet of paper, has been left uninscribed, and this is a mark of respect on the part of the following inscriber. This man, Wang Shizhen, was a great connoisseur who lived at the end of the 16th century, and he identifies the painting confidently as that of guoxi, the master himself. Following close behind him is an inscription that brings us right down to the present. The distinctive calligraphy is that of Zhang Daqian, one of the great modern painters, collectors, and connoisseurs of the later 20th century, and this inscription records that he viewed this painting while airing it on a sunny day at his Great Wind Pavilion in the year 1955. Part of the pleasure of a hand scroll is that one gets to review and return to the place where one came from. We reconnect with the painting by being able to revisit its previous viewings, the record of its transmission. In fact, Zhao Mengfu's viewing of this painting is perhaps the most significant because it was Zhao Mengfu in the early 14th century who actually spearheaded a revival of the guoxi style and transformed it into something entirely different. In fact, we have in the collection a remarkable hand scroll by Zhao Mengfu that may well have been inspired by this very hand scroll. Let me get it out now. Put the two scrolls side by side, we notice immediately that Zhao Mengfu has created a landscape with pines and a level distance that clearly echoes and evokes the earlier master's style. But if this painting is derived from the earlier work, what strikes me immediately is the differences as well as the similarities. We see how Zhao Mengfu has taken the earlier composition. He's reversed it so that you have the prominent trees at the culmination of guoxi's painting have now been moved to the front of the scroll, while the distant mountains that start at the beginning of guoxi's landscape have been relegated to the finale of Zhao's painting. Zhao has chosen to use paper instead of silk. Paper takes the ink differently than silk. It's more responsive to the touch of the brush, the graded ink tones. But what is equally noticeable to me is he's emptied all of the wash out of the painting. All of the ink wash that guoxi used to lovingly describe the rock surfaces, the tactile qualities of the trees and mountains, has been removed from the Zhao Mengfu. Everything is stark. We're confronted with the very bones of the landscape. It's as if Zhao was trying to turn our attention away from the mood, the season. He's telling us that it is the brushwork rather than the content of the painting that is what is most important. Nothing could make that more clear than the long inscription Zhao adds at the end of his painting, for there he writes directly on top of the fading hills and marshlands of his landscape, refuting our ability to read this as a representation of a landscape. He insists on making us read it as a pattern of brushstrokes. He says, "When I was young, I used to practice calligraphy, and in my free time I would play around with small landscapes. But I always found that landscape painting was the most difficult." He then ends with a comment that says, "I dare not compare my own paintings with those of the ancient masters, and yet when I see what recent painters have done, I dare say my own work is a little different." Well, that's an understatement. Zhao's painting is in fact nothing short of revolutionary. He has rejected the goal of representation that was the major focus of earlier painters, and instead he has emphasized something entirely new. He's striving here to create a form of painting that is pure self-expression. He uses the elements of landscape as a vehicle, but the way in which he draws them is pure calligraphy. Look at the outline of this rock, for example. The way in which the bristles of the brush have been separated to allow the white paper to peek through the ink is called flying white. It's a technique of calligraphy common to cursive script. In the trunk of the pine trees, on the other hand, Zhao uses a steady, even stroke with a centered brush tip that is common to seal script, while these flicking hook strokes that define some of the branches of the smaller trees really come out of standard script, referring not to nature, but to a calligraphic technique. He says that he's playfully making this landscape. Elsewhere, he uses the verb to write rather than to paint to describe what he's doing. He writes out the landscape, and the brushwork now becomes like handwriting. It becomes a personal signature that signifies the artist's presence within his painting. I think that's significant. What it really means is painting by the 14th century has moved away from describing landscape, evoking a mood, suggesting a story, to a kind of self-portraiture. And with that point of view in mind, we can now return to the Guoxi and re-examine that painting from the same perspective. Guoxi's painting lacks the specific evidence that the colophon on Zhao Mengfu's painting still has, but recent scholarship has turned up a series of poems composed for a certain elderly gentleman who was preparing to leave the capital and return to Luoyang to retire at the end of a long and successful political career. And in fact, the poems mention specifically an autumn landscape and level distance by the painter Guoxi that was created on this occasion to celebrate this parting moment between friends. There is within the Guoxi all kinds of picture elements that suggest that there was a specific recipient in mind. The fact that there are pairings of trees and fishermen and travelers all convey the idea that one of these men is going to be living closer to nature like the fisherman, that he's setting forth on a journey. Also, the imagery of the painting is evocative of retirement, of withdrawal, of the end of one's life. The sense of autumn that broods over the landscape reflects on the advanced age of the men. As we look at this painting, we have a sense that these two gnarled and aged trees seem to evoke directly the connection between the two elderly gentlemen who are about to share a last meal together before one sets off on his journey. As we read through this landscape, we come to understand that Guoxi is not merely representing nature, but that he is already taking qualities that we associate with calligraphy and poetry and using landscape painting to convey the same kind of poetic meaning.